Alright, we're back with another game review from Felipe. He is playing the black pieces and he is following the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course. So we get the Caro-Kann advanced variation, and Felipe plays 3c5 with the idea of bishop out to f5 and then e6. So we're kind of getting a French defense with the bishop outside of the pawn chain. That's why we like this 3c5 line so much. After c3 we see knight to c6. And already look at this pressure that we're building on the d4 pawn. C takes d4 is threatened, the knight points at d4. The queen can help attack this pawn next. Maybe this knight can route out to f5 to pressure this pawn. So we're going to make this game about the d4 pawn. And that's the best way to kind of think about this opening positionally, is think of the pawn weaknesses on white's side. Alright, so now white plays f4. This is an aggressive looking move, but with all of these pawns on dark squares, it makes this bishop on c1 a really bad bishop. That bishop is trapped in by all of the pawns. So we can positionally play against this. And this is something that I could tell Felipe was thinking already at this point, because he aims later on for a nice imbalance of a knight against the bad bishop. So here Felipe plays bishop f5. This is the first mistake of the game. The reason bishop f5 immediately is not the best move is because after d takes c5, if we go e6 trying to win the pawn back, white can play bishop to e3, and it's actually not very easy to win this pawn back. So instead of starting with bishop to f5, in this position it's better to take the pawn right away. This is our ChessGoals recommendation, and then play bishop f5. So very close to the move order you had, Felipe, but start with c takes d. Just cement that pawn as the weakest pawn on the board, this d4 pawn, and then bring your bishop out and go e6. So here white makes a mistake with bishop to b5, and now I'm going to tell you what sounds like opposite advice, but it's actually a little bit different. Now that we have this bishop outside of the pawn chain, we don't want to take on d4 immediately. We want to just start with e6. This gets us into that full French defense structure with the bishop outside the pawn chain, and what I would argue is kind of a wasted move by white with this pawn on f4. I think that pawn on f4 doesn't help white at all. It actually makes some more weaknesses in their position and traps in the bishop. So let's say we did play e6 here. If knight f3, we can now play a move like a6, taking advantage of this bishop out here on b5. And if white takes, we take back. And after castling, one really nice move that we can do here is play h5. It looks like knight h6 is where we want the knight, and that is a good square for it. But by playing h5 first, this actually gives you a little extra protection for the knight by defending the g4 square. Because a common idea for white in these structures, when you see the three pawns and the bishop here, oftentimes white wants to go h3 and g4, attacking that bishop on f5. And we don't want to allow that. We don't want to allow those chances for white to expand kingside when the center's locked up and kind of trap our minor pieces or put them on bad squares. So here h5 is a really good move, followed by knight h6. And black already has a nice advantage here. And we can play queenside next, like c5, a5, rook b8, bring the other pawn up. All of this looks really good for black. So in the game, Felipe played c takes d4 here. And one thing that white could do to try to take advantage of this move order is bring the knight out first. And after d takes c, knight takes c3, e6, there's this nice move, knight d4, hitting the bishop on f5 and double attacking the knight on c6. And even though we have this, now it kind of makes this f8 bishop uncomfortable. You can just feel that all of our pieces are a little bit stuck, and white actually has a nice initiative here and probably a small advantage. So just a couple small move order things there to keep in mind. But now we're back on track. White took on d4, e6 by black, knight c3, and knight h6 was played. So here again, h5 is a nice improvement to prepare knight h6. Knight h6 right away, h3, and now we have to constantly think about this idea of g4 and making sure that we have a good spot for the bishop. So here a6 was played. And what I like about a6, even though it's not the engine's favorite move, I do like that you played for the bishop pair here. Right, so black has 2 bishops, white has 1, and this pawn is coming up to c5. Knight f3. And at this point, if white did play g4 right here, there's queen h4 check. So that doesn't quite work for white. But when you see knight f3, now g4 is a threat. We have to be aware of this idea. And one thing that we could play here is bishop to e4, which looks a little bit strange, because it looks like white could take. But after d takes, we're on this knight, and when the knight moves, we have queen to d5. And the plan now is knight f5, double attacking this pawn, or maybe even f6, and this knight is close to trapped. So this idea of bishop to e4 is a pretty strong one. And if white ignores it, like let's say castle, we can actually play knight f5 here. And if g4, there's even knight g3, hitting the rook. If the rook moves, now we play h5, and we're starting to build an attack, actually. Something like king g2, trying to trap our knight. We can get away with taking here. And after takes, we have bishop takes f3, queen's coming in. This position is completely falling apart for white. It's already losing. So decent attacking chances there if we can get the h-pawn up the board. So in the game, we had bishop to b4 by Felipe, bishop to d2. Here g4 was a strong idea for white. And bishop takes c3. Now what I like about this is I can tell Felipe is thinking imbalances. Look at this bad bishop. It's still on the same color as all of these pawns. And our bishop is also on the same color of our pawns, but it's outside the pawn chain. So we can use the fact that it's outside the pawn chain to try to trade it off for this knight and create a bad bishop against good knight scenario. And that's exactly what Felipe does here. Bishop to e4. There's no good moves for this knight. Our bishop is hitting the g2 pawn. So white just castles. And after knight f5, the queen moves. Okay, I guess we see a couple more moves here. But Felipe eventually takes the knight on f3. And after g takes, we get this really nice imbalance. Great job setting this up. Now we see queenside castle for black. I think here the king actually belongs on the king side. And then we can play against the queen side. But this is okay still. I think you're doing a great job. You have a nice outpost on f5. So we see a4. And now Felipe starts building this pressure down the g file. So he decides to attack kingside. And I think one reason this might not be quite as effective as the queenside play is these pawns do a great job keeping our knight outpost, but offering up some of these trades might allow that dark square bishop to come into the game on the king side. So now we see rook g1, rook g8, trade, and we have another trade, and now Felipe is trying to get the queens off the board. And I'm not going to harp on those moves too much. There were some advantages that black could have had that were a little bit different than what Felipe played, but I love this endgame. And I think even though the engine right now is saying like 0.6 for black, this is a zero risk position for black. White should never win this game, and there's really good chances for black to outmaneuver white to get the win. So first Felipe brings the king around. Love this idea. And now this is the decisive blunder. And the crazy thing with this move is it doesn't look like it's that big of a deal, but it's because black's position is so dominant positionally and white can't figure out a good move. That's what leads to the blunder. White's almost in a zugzwang here, right? This bishop on c3 can't move because it defends this pawn. The king doesn't want to move because the black king might advance. Maybe b3 could be played, but really what's happening here is white felt like they were running out of moves, and they played h4. It looks like a logical move. Well, this is already losing. Felipe correctly plays h5 check, And after the king retreats, he plays knight e3, and now you can see this king ready to start coming into the light squares. King g3, king f5, king f3. Now here Felipe missed a really strong move. He was still able to get the win, but it's knight to d1. Now we see the complete Zugzwang in white's position. There are no moves here. The bishop can't move, the pawn can't move, the king doesn't want to move. Let's just say king here. We could actually trade this and play king e4. There's no counterplay for the white king. It has to give up ground, and all these pawns are going to fall. So knight d1 puts the game away on the spot. Felipe brought the knight back to g4. And in a couple moves, we'll see another mistake by white. Right here. Because now there's king g6. This threatens knight to f5, which is going to hit the bishop, and this pawn, all at the same time. White's completely busted. They actually walked their king into the fork. But that was a really nice endgame. Nice knight versus bishop imbalance. So if we go back and think of the takeaways, there were the couple points in the opening, Felipe, kind of looking at the timing of c takes d right here, and then on the next move, this idea of playing e6 first instead of c takes d, which allows white to gambit a pawn. So those 2 points I think were key. And then this idea of h5, when you see this structure, playing h5 here followed by knight h6, that's a really good one to remember. But then I think, the way you played this positionally, going for that imbalance, really nicely done. And if you want to go just more in depth, Felipe, you could look at this part of the game in more detail with Stockfish and look at some other ideas, like maybe playing queenside instead of queenside castling. You could castle kingside. And also this kind of idea of g5, I think gave white some chances to get back into the game if they play a little more accurately. But really that's kind of nitpicking. I think overall you did a really good job creating this outpost and this imbalance to win the game. So this was the game review of Felipe's game. He's a ChessGoals member. Check out the links in the description. We have a Caro-Kann course. You get videos, PGN files. You get access to our Discord server. And then we also have study plans, which tell you day by day exactly what to do for 12 weeks. That also gives you access to our Discord server. We have a great community of chess improvers, and yeah, everyone's in there always kind of talking about study plans, new ideas to improve. It's a really great community. So check out those links below. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next one.